Okay, let's dive right in. We've got quite a bit of material here today,
We do.
all focused on, well, a really specific moment, but one that tells us a lot, I think.
Absolutely. It's about that proposal from Ukrainian President Zelenskyy.
Right, for that high-level summit, Ukraine, the U.S., and Russia, and maybe more importantly, how Moscow actually responded.
Exactly. And our goal in this deep dive, looking at these sources, is to really cut through the official statements, the commentary, and figure out what Moscow's reaction really meant.
Because it wasn't just a straightforward no, was it?
Not at all. The sources make it clear the Kremlin's response was layered. It was strategic communication, really, with different messages happening at once.
Okay, so we need to unpack that rejection, see what it tells us about diplomacy or maybe the lack of it in this conflict right now.
Precisely, where things actually stand.
All right, so let's start with the proposal itself. Zelenskyy floats this idea. Him, Biden, Putin, all in a room. Based on our sources, what was he trying to achieve? What was the goal there?
Well, looking through the material, it seems pretty clear it was an attempt to shake things up. You know, the existing talks, the bilateral ones between just Ukraine and Russia.
They were stalled. Badly stalled.
Totally stalled. So this looks like an effort to break that deadlock, find a new way forward.
Like a circuit breaker, maybe.
Exactly that. And a big part of it, clearly, was bringing the U.S. much more directly into the picture.
His main international backer.
Right. So getting Washington right there at the table, that adds leverage for Kyiv. It makes sure Ukraine's perspective is central when the big powers are talking.
It's also a statement, isn't it, about Ukraine's role in this whole geopolitical situation.
Absolutely. It implicitly says, we are central to this. You need to talk with us at the highest level. So, yeah, a bid for a new high-stakes format.
Okay, so that's the pitch. How did Moscow take it? The sources talk a lot about Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, his official response.
Yeah, Peskov's response is, well, it's classic Kremlin in a way. The material describes it as having this sort of diplomatic gloss on it.
Sounding reasonable, perhaps.
Appearing conditional, yes.
Right.
But underneath that, ultimately pretty dismissive, carefully worded, but the message wasn't exactly welcoming.
What was the core condition? What did he say needed to happen first?
He basically said any talk about a trilateral summit like that depends on getting meaningful results first.
Meaningful results from?
From those bilateral Russian-Ukrainian talks, the ones that were already stalled.
So pushing it back to the process that wasn't working.
Precisely. It shifts the burden entirely back onto Kyiv and says, effectively, you need to sort out these core issues with us first, on our terms, in the old format.
And did Peskov give any hint about what meaningful results might look like from Moscow's point of view?
He did, actually. He mentioned two specific things, according to the sources. A temporary truce and maritime safety, specifically in the Black Sea. And he apparently added that conditions for a truce would need agreement, and this Black Sea safety issue would have to be an integral part of the probable future understanding.
That Black Sea part feels significant. Why the focus there?
Well, the sources really highlight this. The Black Sea is just a critical strategic zone. Control over shipping there is vital for Ukraine's economy, particularly grain exports.
And it's been a major flashpoint.
A huge one. So Moscow insisting that maritime safety becomes integral to any future deal, it suggests they want to lock in their dominance or influence there as a precondition for any broader de-escalation.
Okay, but didn't Peskov also say something about Putin being open to high-level contacts? That sounds a bit more positive.
It sounds it, but there was a huge but attached. The sources are really clear on this. The caveat was immediate. Any such contacts absolutely must align with Moscow's core strategic priorities.
And did they specify what those were?
Yes. The one priority explicitly mentioned right then and there was the inadmissibility of NATO expansion to the east.
The big one. Back to Russia's core justification narrative.
Exactly. It loops right back. It signals that any top-level chat, especially involving the U.S., has to first acknowledge and deal with that specific Russian demand.
So the openness is very conditional.
Extremely. As the analysis in our sources suggest, Peskov framed it so that engagement is only really possible if the agenda, and likely the outcomes, serve Russia's predefined interests. Not much space for Ukraine to shape things on an equal footing there.
Okay, so that's Peskov. Formal, conditional, ultimately pushing back. But the sources point to a totally different kind of message coming out of Moscow around the same time. Much more aggressive.
Oh, much more. From Dmitry Medvedev.
Right. Former president, now deputy chair of the Security Council. His style is different.
Vastly different. As the material notes, he often uses his Telegram channel for these really blunt, personal, often quite contemptuous statements. He reflects that hawkish wing.
And his take on Zelensky's summit idea was not diplomatic.
Not even slightly. He apparently called it a desperate, self-serving attempt at legitimacy, just completely dismissed it out of hand.
And the language used, the sources mentioned some pretty specific insults.
Yeah, really scathing stuff, mocking, dehumanizing. He apparently referred to Zelensky as green AF.
Green meaning?
Likely inexperienced, naive, maybe incompetent, definitely a pejorative in that context.
And there was more, wasn't there? Something about insects.
Yes, that's a recurring theme in his rhetoric, as the sources point out, designed to delegitimize. He apparently asked why this green ephid wanted talks with the U.S. and Russian presidents, and said a three-way chat would give powerful legitimization of the insect due to the authority of those present just dripping with contempt.
And beyond the sheer insults, Medvedev leveled some pretty serious accusations, too.
He did. Claimed Zelensky was plotting to delay elections, trying to appease nationalist elites, and even misappropriating Ukraine's defense funds.
And our sources note these aren't exactly new lines from Moscow.
No, they fit a pattern. These are recurring themes in Russian state narratives trying to paint Zelensky as corrupt, illegitimate, or controlled by extremists, undermining him personally.
He didn't stop at Zelensky either, did he? He brought European leaders into it.
Right. He extended that insect analogy, describes Zelensky as an insect protected by ants.
Protected by ants? Who are the ants?
He specifically named French President Macron, German opposition leader Friedrich Merz, and UK Labour leader Keir Starmer, calling them beneficiaries of this symbiosis.
And the implied message there, according to the material.
The implication is pretty clear. These European leaders aren't supporting Ukraine out of principle, but for their own mutual cynical interests. It's an attempt to portray Western backing as entirely self-serving.
Trying to discredit that support, drive wedges in the alliance.
Exactly. Frame it as transactional, not based on shared values or security concerns.
So you've got Peskov being formally dismissive and Medvedev being openly vitriolic. What do our sources suggest is the point of this two-track approach, this dual messaging?
This is really one of the key insights, I think. The sources argue this two-pronged strategy is quite deliberate. Peskov handles the official, diplomatic front, keeps the door notionally open, allows Russia to look like it could engage.
Maintain plausible deniability, perhaps.
Maybe. While Medvedev, as one source puts it, acts like the id of the Kremlin. He voices the raw, unfiltered anger and aggression that the official channels maybe can't or won't.
So it sends different signals.
Or to different audiences.
Precisely. It achieves several things at once. It can test how harsher lines land internationally. It definitely appeals to the hardliners inside Russia. And it sends a very direct, unambiguous message of contempt and intransigence to Kyiv and its backers.
So Peskov offers a theoretical path, however narrow.
While Medvedev slams the door shut and throws away the key, rhetorically speaking, it signals a really deep level of opposition.
Okay, so if we synthesize all the Peskov's conditions, Medvedev's venom, what's the overall message Moscow sent back about this summit idea?
Well, the overwhelming takeaway from the sources is profound skepticism, bordering on outright rejection, unless it's entirely on Moscow's terms. Any summit is positioned as a very distant possibility.
Dependent on what? Dependent entirely on Ukraine first making major concessions in those bilateral talks, concessions Moscow wants, and accepting Russia's non-negotiable strategic demands, particularly about NATO.
So Moscow essentially said, we won't give you the status of this three-way meeting unless you've already given us what we want.
Pretty much. They signaled they wouldn't grant Zelensky that perceived equality or legitimacy unless Ukraine was already operating from a position of significantly weakened leverage, having caved on key points.
And this all seems to circle back to something the sources really hammer home. This idea that any real diplomacy, any chance of a summit like this, is tied directly to the battlefield.
Yes, that connection is drawn very starkly. The phrase used is that it hinges on what unfolds, where battlefield outcomes still dictate diplomatic thresholds.
What does that mean in practice?
It means diplomacy isn't really being seen or used as a tool to create peace proactively. It's more reactive. Russia's actual willingness to talk seriously and the terms it's willing to consider are presented as being directly tied to how things are going militarily.
Success on the battlefield means less need to compromise diplomatically.
That's the strong implication in the analysis, yes. If Russia feels it's winning or can achieve its aims militarily, there's less incentive to engage in diplomacy that doesn't simply ratify those gains.
And the consequences of relying on battlefield outcomes to set the stage for talks. They're pretty grim, aren't they?
They really are. It suggests, unfortunately, that more fighting is likely, as both sides might see military gains as necessary to strengthen their future negotiating position.
It also means Russia might only entertain talks that lock in its maximalist goals.
That's the concern highlighted, and any closed-doors talks that might happen are seen as very vulnerable to these power dynamics, potentially bypassing formal processes and transparency.
Okay, let's just drill down a bit more into some of these key pieces the sources brought up. Those meaningful results Peskov wanted. First, what do the sources suggest Russia really means by that?
Well, based on the analysis presented, from Moscow's perspective, meaningful results almost certainly means major Ukrainian concessions.
Such as?
Things like territory acknowledging Russian control over Crimea, the Donbass, maybe other occupied areas, guarantees of neutrality, so abandoning the NATO goal permanently. And then those vaguely defined terms like demilitarization and denazification.
Which could mean anything from limits on Ukraine's military to actual regime change.
Exactly. It's a very, very high bar for Kyiv to clear, without sacrificing core sovereignty and its future path. The sources frame it as almost insurmountable under current conditions.
And the Black Sea maritime safety point, just to reiterate its importance.
Yeah, the sources stress this isn't a minor detail. An agreement forced under current military realities would likely cement Russia's dominance there. It could involve restrictions on Ukraine's navy or shipping, granting Russia de facto control that Kyiv would see as a major violation of sovereignty.
Got it. And Putin's supposed openness. How should we really read that, given the core strategic priorities condition?
The sources read it as careful diplomatic signaling. Saying you're open makes you sound potentially reasonable on the world stage.
But the conditions attached.
The conditions make it clear its openness on very narrow terms. It's primarily about pushing Russia's key security demands, NATO non-expansion being top the list directly to the U.S.
So from Putin's viewpoint, a summit might be less about Ukraine itself and more about that bigger U.S.-Russia dynamic.
That's how the analysis leans, yes. Ukraine's situation becomes almost a subset of Russia's larger geopolitical aims and its direct confrontation with Washington.
Okay, let's swing back to Medvedev for a second.
Okay.
What's his role in all this and the effect of that really extreme rhetoric?
The sources paint him as having carved out this niche as the Kremlin's primary attack dog, using platforms like Telegram very deliberately. His function seems to be several things at once.
What?
Signaling absolute inflexibility to the West, rallying the hardline base within Russia, maybe providing that plausible deniability for the more formal statements, oh, that's just Medvedev.
Yeah.
And crucially, using that dehumanizing language, the insect stuff, to justify ongoing aggression and delegitimize Ukraine's entire leadership.
Right. And quickly, why did Zelenskyy want the U.S. there, and why would Russia perhaps not want them there in that format?
Well, for Zelenskyy, it's obvious, isn't it? The U.S. is the key ally, the main supplier of aid and support. Having Biden there provides immense diplomatic weight, acts as a counter to Putin, and ensures Ukraine's interests are strongly represented.
Makes sense. And for Russia?
For Russia, direct U.S. involvement in this specific format, giving Kyiv that kind of equal footing, is likely seen as problematic. The sources suggest Moscow views the U.S. as the main force enabling Ukrainian resistance and driving anti-Russian policies. They might prefer to deal with the U.S. separately or on terms where Russia dictates the structure.
Okay. And finally, that ants comment about European leaders, just to be clear on the message there.
Yeah, calling Macomb, Mers, Starmer ants, protecting the insect, it's just pure dismissal. The narrative push, as the sources explain, is that European support isn't principled, it's just mutual cynical interests. It's all about trying to undermine Western solidarity and sow discord.
Wow. Okay, so when you pull all of that together from the sources, the formal, no but maybe, the outright contempt from Medvedev, the specific demands tied to NATO and territory, and this constant linkage back to the battlefield. What does this whole episode tell you, the listener, about the prospects for diplomacy right now? It feels like the sides are incredibly far apart.
That's certainly the picture the material paints. The diplomatic threshold for any kind of meaningful dialogue, especially from Moscow's perspective as presented here, seems extraordinarily high. It demands concessions that fundamentally challenge Ukraine's sovereignty and Western security positions.
So the big takeaway from this deep dive into the sources, Moscow effectively said no to Zelensky's summit idea, at least on any terms Kyiv could realistically accept. The rejection was layered. You had Peskov's official conditional response tying it to bilateral progress and Russia's core demands on NATO, and then Medvedev's raw personal attack.
And underpinning it all, as the sources stress, is the battlefield reality. The outcomes there are seen as dictating what's even possible diplomatically. That contrast between Peskov and Medvedev, it shows a very deliberate, multi-level communication strategy.
Yeah, sending different messages all at once.
Exactly. So the door to that kind of trilateral summit, according to this analysis, it seems firmly locked by preconditions that are, for now, likely non-starters for Ukraine.
Which really leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over, based on everything we've just unpacked from these sources. If diplomacy, as depicted here, seems so heavily dependent on what happens on the battlefield, what does that really tell us about how power and negotiation function in modern conflict? And if the diplomatic track is so tied to military outcomes, where should we even look for potential shifts or openings for peace?